Hey guys, welcome back to Life of Bliss. Today I'm going to be going over the complete design and build process of these bookshelf speakers right here. So if you guys have been on my channel before, you'll know I've done several large-scale builds for my home theater. With this build, I decided to roll it back a little bit and do something pretty simple. Maybe some of you guys who haven't done any DIY speaker building, or you want to get into it but don't want to spend a ton of money on components, this would be a great first build just to kind of get your feet wet. For the driver, I went with a 5-inch driver from Tang Band. This is a full range driver that will do most of the frequency range. It goes down to about 60 hertz and goes all the way up to 20,000 hertz. So besides the real low bass, it should do a great job. Now with it being a full range driver, we're not going to have to do any crossovers or soldering or anything like that. So we'll go ahead and start off with a computer program that I use to figure out the box dimensions and port size, and we'll go on from there. Before I get to the build, I'd like to say a big thanks to Parts Express for supplying the parts and components used in this build. Parts Express is one of the largest suppliers in the US for drivers, speaker components, amplifiers, and related electronics. I've been using Parts Express for years on various builds and have been extremely happy with the selection, price, and fast shipping they've provided. I'll leave a link in the description below so you can check out Parts Express for any of your speaker building needs. The Tang Band model I'll be using is the W5-1611SAF. This is a 5-inch full-range driver that will do well in a small ported enclosure. To start, I needed the Thiel small parameters. These are located either on the Parts Express product page, or there is a PDF to download from either Parts Express or Tang Band's website. These will be put into a program called WinISD to graph the frequency response of different box sizes and port volumes. Parts Express also has a few recommended box sizes off to the side, so that will give me a good starting point in WinISD. Like I mentioned, WinISD is a program that allows you to input speaker parameters and visually see the predicted response in various box sizes. This program is free to download, and I'll leave a link down below. Once all of the parameters are entered, I played around with the different box and port sizes until I landed on a volume and response that I liked. I was trying to keep the box as small as possible while still getting a good response, and ended up with a 0.4 cubic foot box with a round port that was 2.5 inches in diameter and 8.5 inches long. Parts Express has several different diameter ports that can be cut to length, so I tried several sizes before choosing this one. To account for port volume and driver displacement, I reduced the box volume slightly in WinISD from 0.4 to 0.38 cubic foot to get a more accurate measurement. Looking at the frequency response, this configuration gave me a very flat response down to 80 Hz with an F3 or -3 decibel point of roughly 58 Hz. Changing the box size and port frequency will change the response and the port dimensions. This is just something that you'll have to experiment with until you find the right size and response you're looking for. Once I had my box volume, I like to head to a site called the12volt.com to use their enclosure volume calculator. You can calculate this yourself, but this is a quick and easy tool that takes the thickness of material into account and is easy to get quick volumes when making changes to your dimensions. Alright, now we're on to the fun stuff. I went with some scrap 3/4 inch MDF I had for the box. You can probably get by with a circular saw or track saw, but to get the most accurate and repeatable cuts, a table saw is your best route. There are a couple of tools that I'll mention today that make this process much easier and give you a better looking end product, and a table saw is one of those tools. After cutting all the sides, it's important to mock up the enclosure to make sure there are no major gaps or measurement errors. So if you plan on getting into making speakers, one really good investment is a nice plunge router. This will allow you to start and stop cuts in the center of a board and make circle cutouts and things like that. This is a plunge router by Bosch. As you can see, it goes up and down. You can set it to a depth that you'd like to cut it to, and it will stop at that depth. And then this on the bottom here is a Jasper jig. This is a circle cutting guide that allows you to make perfect circles with the router here. And you'll see me use this in a moment, but essentially all these holes on the bottom here have different diameters for the circle. And you'll just place a pin in the diameter that you want, and then there's a hole in the center of your cutout on your board. that you'll make, and you'll place that pin in that hole, and then you'll be able to draw a perfect circle with your router. After finding the height that I want to mount the driver and marking the center, I drilled out a center hole for the Jasper jig to work from. With the pieces being so small, it was hard to clamp them to any surface, so I attached them to a larger board on the backside of the piece to secure it while cutting. Looking back, the hole cutting process would have been a little easier once the box was assembled and veneer attached, so keep that in mind. Now the first cut I'll be making is the flush mount recess for the driver. This will allow the driver to sit down into the face of the front baffle and have a completely flush appearance. I suggest making some test cuts into a scrap piece of wood to make sure that your depth and circle diameter is correct before cutting your baffle. I do this with almost all of my router cuts. You'll want to adjust the pin and the Jasper jig to a smaller diameter circle a few times to give yourself plenty of room for the recess. After the recess is cut, I adjusted the router and jig to cut out the mounting hole. Here's just another quick view of how the Jasper jig works. The pin is put into the correct hole for the diameter of circle I'm wanting to cut, placed into the center hole on the board, and the plunge router is lowered to make the circular cut. Here I am cutting out the mounting holes for the port tubes. So after I check to make sure that the speakers, the ports, and the boxes are fitting together nicely, it's time to go ahead and assemble everything. I've got both boxes sitting here, and you're going to need a couple of things to do this. First off, you're going to need some good clamps just to hold everything together as it either sets up or as you're nailing things together. You can use just wood glue and clamps. I use Tang Band 2 myself, and you can throw a few pieces together, clamp them down, let that set up, and then move on to the next pieces, glue it, clamp it, let it set up. I like to use an 18 gauge nailer, especially since we're going to be finishing these in veneer. I'm just going to go ahead and set these up with the glue, nail them to hold them together, and then move on to my next board so I don't have to wait a few hours in between putting boards together. Now, as I'm putting this together as well, I'm going to be throwing in some of this foam that I had left over from another speaker build. This is about 1.5 inch foam that will just help dampen that enclosure. And what that means is it's going to prevent a lot of the sound waves bouncing around the enclosure to come back and hit the back of that speaker, which will cause distortion. So I'm just going to be using some 3M spray glue to throw this in the enclosure as well. For box assembly, you just want to make sure to apply plenty of wood glue and align the boards up with clamps before adding 4 or 5 brad nails per side to secure them while the glue dries. Clean up any excess glue with a damp rag to make prepping for veneer easier later on. I usually will assemble the bottom to the back, then add the sides, top, and front baffle last. Before completely closing up the box, I cut out a few pieces of foam to cover the sides and back of the enclosure. A little bit of spray adhesive will hold these into place. The port hole will need to be cut open with a razor to allow the port tube in there later on. Continuing on, the top piece was added along with another piece of foam, and finally the front baffle added last. With everything assembled, it's time to come back and clean up the nail holes and edges to prep for veneer. This part is especially important if you are planning to do a different finish such as Duratex or a high gloss paint job. Any hole or minor imperfection will be noticeable. I used some wood filler to fill in all of the holes and smooth out some of the edges. The edges with a decent gap will need wood putty built up along the edge and sanded smooth with the rest of the side so the box does not have an uneven or wavy look to it. A quick look at the boxes before sanding, as well as this good looking dog. After a mandatory pet break, I took an orbital sander with 220 grit paper and smoothed out all of the wood filler. So like I said earlier, I'm going to be finishing these off with some wood veneer. This is some walnut wood veneer from Parts Express. So what I'm going to be doing is cutting some pieces just oversized to what I need for each panel and then gluing them down with some contact cement. So I'll get started cutting those pieces out. I wanted to match the grain along the sides and the top, so a piece was cut long enough to make that happen. I marked the edges of each piece, cut them out with a sharp razor, and labeled where each would go with some painter's tape. I needed the front and back pieces to have the wood grain flow from top to bottom as well. Just be sure to label all of your pieces so you know how to apply them later. So like I mentioned earlier, this is my first time using wood veneer on anything, and I went ahead and did the bottom and the back side already, and I put everything on with some contact cement, went back with a razor blade and trimmed off all the edges, and used some sandpaper to clean everything up. I did make a few mistakes with the razor. I cut into the veneer a little bit. I'll show you some close-ups here, but I didn't get it 100% perfect with that blade. I was able, like I said, to sand everything fairly smooth, and it does look good, so you can do this with just a razor blade. But I'm going to go ahead and try using my router with my flush trim bit on the rest of these sides here. So I'm going to go ahead and show you the process of adding the veneer and then using the flush trim bit to clean up the edges. I'll be using some contact cement from Weldwood to adhere the veneer and using a veneer roller to press it down, as well as a smaller plastic tool which will apply a little more pressure than the roller will. I just used a small brush to spread out an even layer of contact cement on both the box and the back of the veneer. The porous edges of the MDF like to soak up liquid, so I hit those again with more contact cement after it had soaked in. The order in which I added the veneer was the bottom first, then the back, sides, front, then the top last. This helps reduce the amount of visible seams. You want to wait at least 5 minutes for the contact cement to dry to where it is not tacky to the touch. At that point, I carefully added the pieces in the correct position. Be sure not to touch the veneer to the box until centered, as the contact cement is permanently bonded once contact is made. You won't be able to pull up the veneer to reposition. Pushing everything out from the center, I use the veneer roller and plastic tool to ensure good contact throughout the entire piece. I forgot to mention this earlier, but you want to cut each piece so that there is at least a ½ inch overhang for each side. You can use a razor like I did, but this process is much easier to use a router with a flush trim bit. This gave a very straight edge that took a minimal amount of sanding to smooth out. The only issue I had with using the router was the paper backing on the veneer would sometimes not get removed with the rest of the material. I don't know if it was just the veneer I was using or what, but coming back with a razor blade and cutting it off was a quick and easy fix. This was still a much faster and cleaner way than using a razor to trim the veneer. Like I mentioned earlier, making the speaker and portholes would have been a little easier to do at this point, since the box would be easier to clamp down on my bench. The porthole wasn't as bad, as I was able to just use the flush trim bit on my router to remove the excess material. I wasn't able to do this with the speaker opening, as the flush mount recess didn't allow the bit enough room. I carefully went around the edge with a sharp new razor and was able to follow the cutout for a clean look. But again, if I could do it over, cutting the holes at this point with the router would have been quicker and given a cleaner cutout. Before attaching the top piece of veneer, I matched up the wood grain to make it look like one continuous piece. At this point, the boxes were complete and it was time for the finishing process. Before applying any stain, all sides and edges were sanded with 400 grit paper to smooth out any imperfections. For this build, I went with a red mahogany stain from Minwax. I used a rag to apply stain to each side and wipe off any excess as I went. I was able to come up with a genius ratchet strap drying rack by placing a small strip of wood inside the enclosure and hanging it from the hook. This helped me to finish staining the bottom and allowed me to spray a top coat on all sides at the same time. As for the top coat, I went with a water-based, oil-modified polyurethane from Minwax in a semi-gloss sheen. There are many different ways and options you could choose to apply the top coat. This can be applied with a foam or bristle brush, and there are many spray can options available as well. I prefer to use an HVLP spray gun as I find it quicker and can get an extremely smooth finish with spraying. Spraying a 50% overlap, I sprayed each side of the enclosure and let it dry for at least 6 hours. Between coats, I went over the entire surface with 400 grit sandpaper to smooth out any bubbles or dust. I did this for a total of 3 coats. If you decide to spray, I would suggest practicing on some scrap wood if you are not familiar with it, but after each coat you want the surface to have a smooth wet look without any dry spots immediately after spraying. Be careful not to spray too heavy as this can create runs in the finish, but this should give you a super smooth result if done correctly. Almost done, on to the finishing touches. For connecting speaker wire, I went with some binding posts from Dayton Audio. For these, you simply have to drill 2 holes on the back of the enclosure to allow the posts to pass through and screw the ends together. I also centered the driver in the mounting hole and drilled out some holes for the screws. Or at least I would have if my battery hadn't died. No problem, just grab the other battery and carry on. You gotta be kidding me. While I questioned my life choices as the battery charged, I grabbed some 14 gauge wire to connect the speakers to the binding posts. The speakers will take spade connectors and the binding posts just accept bare wire. You'll need to go back and cut out a little foam where the binding posts come through the box. I found it easiest to attach the wire to the posts while it was outside of the box, then screw the 2 pieces together. Like I mentioned during the planning phase, I ended up going with a 2.5 inch diameter port that was 8.5 inches long. You can cut these down to size if need be, this just happened to work out perfectly. This is a compression fit port, so it just needed to be pushed into place. Before adding the speaker, I took some gasket tape to seal the mounting hole as there is none on the speaker itself. I connected the wire to the terminals and screwed it into place. The last step was adding feet to the bottom of the enclosure. There are many different products including spikes and screw-on rubber feet that you can use. I really like a product called Isolate It, which is a sorbothane rubber pad you can get in various shapes and sizes with a sticky backing. These do a great job isolating the enclosure and protect it and whatever surface you set it on. And here's the final product. So I'm super happy with the way these speakers turned out. You could get this project done over a few weekends with a large amount of the time being spent waiting for the polyurethane to dry between coats. Using the full range Tang Band drivers takes the guesswork and soldering out of the equation. Paired with a decent amp, these speakers will have no trouble filling any room in a home with sound. It may be hard to tell in the pictures, but the finish on these came out extremely smooth, and I'm really happy with the way the Minwax polyurethane laid down. If you are wanting to try out making your own speakers, this is a great project to start with that won't break the bank at under $200 for all of the parts and finishes to complete. So hopefully this video helped you guys out in either making these speakers here or getting started on another speaker project that you may have going on. I've listened to these for a few hours now, and I'll be honest, they sound really good for being a full range driver and just being in a smaller enclosure like this. So I'm really excited to get these in my office and use them on a daily basis. I'm going to come back in a couple of weeks after I've had some more listening time and show you some graphs on how the frequency response is in my room and just kind of tell you how they're sounding overall after I get some more listening time in. I'm going to be leaving links down in the description below for all the products that I used in this speaker build, so be sure to check out Parts Express for either these components or any other components that you may need for any of your guys' builds. Now I'm going to head you guys out with a little sound demo, a little bit of excursion footage, and quite possibly some of the best dance moves that you've seen today. So with that, thanks for checking out Life of Bliss, and I will see you guys soon.
It's been so long since I had time to think about it.
Keep on dancing.